welcome to the European Parliament. I'm Nick Griffin, former MEP for the North West of England. I'm joined today by, from my right, Udo Voigt, who's the NPD MEP from Germany, General Georgios Epitidios, Golden Dawn MEP. In this empty chair should have been sitting a gentleman by the name of Alexander Sotnichenko, who is a professor at the University of St. Petersburg. He, however, has been banned from attending. We'll be discussing why during this programme. And to Alexander's left, Roberto Fiore, another former MEP and leader of Italy's Forza Nuova. So let's first of all address the subject of the empty chair. Alexander was due to speak at a press conference here with us in the Parliament today about our efforts, us being the Alliance for Peace and Freedom, to prevent and reverse the new Cold War and prevent the new hot war that's building up in Europe between, on one side, the Washington United States and the European Union, and on the other side, primarily Russia. And he's been banned. He was banned absolutely at the last minute in an email from President Schulz, the President of the European Parliament, this afternoon, when he said, with regards to the participants listed for the above-mentioned meeting, hosted by Mr. Voigt later today, please note that following instructions from the President's office, access to Parliament's premises is not authorised for, and then there's a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Russians, all of them banned. Now, this follows on from June the 2nd. First of all, President Schulz issued a general message about parliamentary relations with Russia, but aimed at Udo Voigt, who'd invited a number of Russians here. And he said that he believes that the Russian blacklist of European politicians, quote, hampers any efforts for constructive dialogue. So in response to that, he said that he's banning access to the Russian ambassador and one other named diplomat. But that was all. But then today, it went on from that. Now, Udo, I gather that you sent a response to Mr. Schulz to that first letter. In brief, what did you say and where's it gone from there?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say I got no answer from Mr. Schulz. But last week we requested room for a press conference to the same our actions to avert cold and hot war in Europe. And then I got an answer from the office from Mr. Schulz in the context of recent access restrictions imposed by the European Parliament on Russian politicals and diplomats as well, as a possibility that the presence of Mr. Andrei Petrov and Mr. Fedor Birkuyev might cause disruptions of the Parliament's activities. The press service has received instructions from its political authorities not to make the Parliament's facilities available for the press conference you requested. And this is an unbelievable situation because maybe Mr. Schulz can say that the Russians cannot come into the Parliament, but I have the right, I think I have the right as a member of Parliament to have a press conference and to say what I wanted to say to the press, but now it's not allowed.
Indeed, further, that initial letter, what was the date of that letter, that email?
It was a letter from the 9th of June.
So on the 9th of June, so just last week,
yes.
Schulz, at the end of that, I believe, said, yes, you can't use the facilities, but they can come into the Parliament.
Yes.
And then today, bang, out of the blue, they can't even come into the Parliament. So, Roberto, I'd like to bring you in here. This strikes me as extraordinary discrimination against Russians who aren't even members of the Russian government. What do you feel about this?
Well, I think this is connected to the theme we have introduced as APF and also in this invitation from Udo Voigt. We say that we want to avoid cold and hot war, bringing patriots from different countries together. The answer of the liberal and pacifist parliament is to avoid this and to create a typical situation of Cold War. I find also extraordinary the fact that whereas, for instance, in Italy, with all the difference we have with the government, I have to say that the Prime Minister, Renzi, the President of the country, Mattarella, and even the Pope have received Putin with all the pomps and with all this honor,
a state visit,
for a state visit, for a full state visit. And now we find that people who have no criminal records, they are not known as extremists. One of the people banned is a simply woman assistant. They are banned basically just because they are Russians. It seems to me that they want to create a situation of Cold War. And if we do not keep our nerves cool, and I have to say this especially for Russians, we probably fall for a trap.
Indeed, it strikes me, it's the new acceptable liberal racism. You can't be racist against Roma gypsies, but you can against Russians, because Russians don't count. And in fact, I was speaking with one of the Russians earlier today, and he was saying, well, this is historically how it starts, that a people are demonized and shut out, and then persecuted. You know.
Yes, I have to remember what Berlusconi said about Mr. Schulz. I think some years ago, he said to him, he is like a couple. And I think today we can say Mr. Schulz declared our guests from Russia as Jews of the day, because this discrimination is not as acceptable, because we had very, very good times in St. Petersburg. We were invited by the Russians, and now we invited him to the European Parliament, and they could see it only from outside. That's unbelievable, because everybody is telling about democracy in Europe. There is no democracy.
Indeed, indeed. So, General, I'd like to bring you in here at this point, just to broaden things out from a former military point of view. What do you think all this, how's this connected with EU foreign policy on Russia, and what do you think of that policy?
Before asking this question, I would like to comment on what we were talking before. And I would say that there are, regrettably, as Roberto pointed out, there are clear indications regarding a Cold War attitude by both sides. And this is not an encouraging issue. You know, both sides are implementing sanctions to each other, and both are impacted of what is happening. If I would like to mention anything, something about the EU foreign policy regarding Russia, I would say that this is at least controversial. On the one hand, the EU admits that Russia is a strategic partner of the EU, but it's a real fact, because in the past it was a very good cooperation among both sides. However, on the other hand, you know, they are implementing and taking sanctions over Russia, which is triggering the reaction of Russia, and it is a turbulence going on. The EU policy says that Russia, you know, is giving expansionist or has expansionist threats against Ukraine. However, on the other side, you know, the EU is expanding to this in a way which could be taken as dangerous for Russia's security.
Yes, indeed.
And yeah, it triggers again reactions from relevant reactions from Russia, which is again is not a positive issue. Yeah. The EU says that we do not cut the ties with the Russian people. However, on the other hand, they are taking sanctions which are imposing, and they are against the Russian people.
Yes. One thing you said there about NATO pushing against Europe reminds me there's a very good meme going around on the English language internet with a picture, a map of Russia, and all the NATO bases near it, saying Russia's really aggressive, look how close they put their borders to our bases. That really does rather sum it up. But of course it's a laughing matter, but it's also not a laughing matter because when you talk about foreign policy, it's perhaps rather dry and academic. But EU foreign policy and the sanctions against Russia go back to the fighting in Ukraine. And this is something where EU policy was to back a clearly illegal coup d'etat by force, including literally gangs of armed neo-Nazi thugs who then went out murdering Russians just because they are Russian, the massacre in Odessa being the worst example. And it's Russia's reaction to a clear provocation organised by and funded by both the European Union and particularly the United States, where Victoria Nuland spoke about investing $5 billion in dragging Ukraine away from a Russian position and bringing it towards the West. And this is an extraordinarily aggressive policy, and Mr. Schulz is just operating one little piece of this. Let's come back to Mr. Schulz. And Udo, I'd like to ask you, do you think that when you compare, as Roberto said, how President Putin was received in Italy by the Italian government, what's Schulz doing? And is Schulz out of control, or is he merely operating a European decided policy?
I think he represents the European side of policy, and he will do everything to stop the Russians and to help the Ukrainians. Is a position of Europe, is a position of NATO, and is a position which Obama gives to Merkel. And I'm wondering, because Schulz is not in the same party like Merkel, is not a conservative, he is a social democrat. Usually they have understandable for the Russians, but in this case, the Social Democrats in Germany are behind NATO, behind the United States of America, and I can't believe it. And for example, for the day, I am wondering too, because we have a lot of left wings here in the European parliaments, and what they are doing now. Because usually they have to solidarize with the Russian people who are not allowed to come into the European Parliament. And I'm wondering what they are doing, because the Russians didn't come to the left, they come to us, and so it doesn't matter that they are not allowed to European parliaments. Maybe you can something explain during your time as a member of the European Parliament if something like this will happen during those time too.
No, certainly, although there's always been an anti-Russian feeling, Russophobia, basically. That's been present, that I've seen, since 2009. But it's certainly increasing. There's a real escalation. And I think Roberto said earlier on that this would have been unthinkable a few years ago, just to keep people out without any explanation. Schulz in his letter has said, we have to have transparency. Where's the transparency in this? Keeping out an academic who wants to come here to talk about peace and trying to find ways to defuse a very dangerous situation. So we're running towards the end of time. In a minute, I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Roberto, to say a few words summing things up. But just before we do, I'd like to raise one point, Udo, that you mentioned, talking about the Europeans helping the Ukraine. I think we need people to understand that this isn't about helping Ukraine. It's not in Ukraine's interest to be torn apart by a civil war created by a brutal policy of repression of Russian speakers who've lived in eastern Ukraine for generations. It's literally their country. It's not in Ukraine's interest for NATO to push towards a war when NATO has a stated policy of first strike, i.e. starting a nuclear war, and also a policy of using a band down the whole of Central Europe as a killing zone, using poison gas and tactical nuclear weapons to create a 200-kilometre wide dead zone in which the Russian army can be wiped out. It would also wipe out all the civilians in those countries. It's a most appalling plan, and that's what NATO stands for. So really, we need people to start thinking, let's calm down a bit, otherwise we're July 1914. It's a very dangerous time to be. So, Roberto, I'd like first of all to ask you just to sum up how you feel about things.
Well, I have to say that on the other hand, it's very clear that the European front is not united. Yes, maybe people here at the top, but peoples are not against Russians. It's very clear that Greece, for instance, is trying to find an accommodation with Russia for its problem, or better, is trying to escape rightly from the domination of the IMF, maybe through a Russian help. The Hungarians are finding very interesting links with Russians, even, as I said, Italy. But there is more than that. There is a lot of forces. For instance, the relation between Vatican and Russians are very good at the moment. So even if you, for instance, if you think for a moment about the trouble in Middle East and the problem with IS, it's very clear that either we find the help of the Russians, or we're not going to defeat these major problems, because the Americans don't want to fight against the IS, whereas it is in the Russian interest and in the European interest to fight it. So in the future, I think that these actions, like the one we saw today, are going to appear as more and more out of pace with the real situation of Europe and the real will of the people.
Okay, thank you very much. General.
I would like to concur with what Roberto said before. In my interpretation as well, there is no hate between the people of European nations against the Russians. There is no reason to have these feelings or these attitudes, just to support a very strange, bizarre, and not encouraging policy of the leaderships. On the other hand, let me be a little bit optimistic and say that we are going to avoid the so-called war, I mean a warm war, because in this area, militarily, Russia is very strong. And I don't believe that people of the other side of the ocean are stupid to support their leadership or some other European countries' leaderships to do anything wrong against Russia, to get involved in an unnecessary war.
We certainly hope you're right. Udo, if there is a war, Germany is often is the case, is in the thick of it, unavoidably for geographic reasons. So what do you think? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I think after 1990, after Glasnost, the Soviets, the Russians sent out all their troops and weapons from the old countries they controlled, from Hungary, from Bulgaria, from Eastern Germany, from Poland. And now NATO captured all these lands. And in Poland, they are very aggressive. They have stationed missile systems now. And in whole Europe, nuclear weapons from the United States are still there. In Netherlands, in Belgium, in Germany. And they didn't ask countries if they allowed this. They do this by their own. And for Germany, it's a terrible position, because if we get a war with Russia against, it will destroy all hopes for a reunited Europe, which can stand against American imperialism all over the world.
Indeed. Well, that's all we've got time for. I'd like to thank our guests, including our missing Russian academic professor friend. I thank you for watching. We're the Alliance for Peace and Freedom. To us, these aren't just words, we actually mean it. Keep watching these programs and please get involved and help. Thank you.